Whoopi Goldberg arrived at the industry event in the mid-2000s for reasons that had nothing to do with comedy. She was there for another obligation, a presentation, an appearance, one of the professional engagements that a career at her level of recognition requires a person to move through in the ordinary course of an industry life. She had not come to watch stand-up. There was not, on her schedule for the evening, a dedicated slot for being an audience for a comedian. And then Katt Williams performed. And she stayed. Not because she was required to, not because the event's schedule had organized itself in a way that made leaving inconvenient. She stayed because what was happening on stage was something she recognized, something her decades in the form had given her the specific equipment to recognize, and she was not going to move away from it before it was finished. To understand why that staying matters, it helps to understand what Whoopi Goldberg's career had given her in the way of a reference point for the form. She had been in stand-up, in theater, in film, in television, in every format that the performing arts use to put a person in front of an audience at the level where those formats operate when they are working at full capacity. She had watched a great many performers work a great many rooms. The standard she was carrying into the event that night was not the standard of someone who had attended a reasonable number of shows. It was the standard of someone who had seen the form at its best from the inside. When she stopped her private conversation with the people around her and turned to watch the stage, the people she had been talking to noticed. Not because there was anything dramatic about the moment, just a person turning toward a performance and becoming still. But the specific quality of stillness had something in it that made the people around her also turn. Here is the first thing about that night that changes how the rest of it should be understood. Whoopi Goldberg had seen something within the first 2 minutes of the set. And what she had seen, what she named afterward to the people who had been around her, was not what any of the younger people in the room would have named as the thing worth noticing. What Whoopi Goldberg said when Katt Williams's set ended was said to the people who had been at her table, the private audience of the private response, before any managed or public version of the response existed. The people adjacent to it have recalled it in the fragmentary way that private responses to public performances are recalled, from the edges, with some variation in the exact words and strong consistency in the substance. What she said was not a compliment in the event table sense of the word, the polished acknowledgement that people with reputations offer carefully in settings where their words will be noted. What she said was a description. She named something specific, the same kind of specific naming that Bernie Mac had done in a Chicago corridor, the same economy of language that serious people use when what they are saying is true and does not require elaboration. She named the relationship. Not the material, not the technique, not the specific jokes or the structure or the pacing. The relationship between Katt Williams and the room. The quality of the connection between the performer and the audience that was visible from the outside to someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. She said it was real. Not in the vague sense that the word is sometimes used to express generalized admiration. In the specific sense that what she had watched was a performer who was actually in the room, actually in the material, actually connected to the audience in the full sense rather than the performed sense. That the relationship was not a construction for the benefit of the room, but something the room was actually receiving. The people at her table received this observation with varying degrees of understanding of what it meant. The ones who had spent their careers in the industry understood it precisely. The The ones who had spent their careers adjacent to the industry understood it partially. What they all understood was that the observation mattered, that it was coming from someone who had the specific equipment to make it, and that its specificity was evidence of its accuracy. And here's the third thing about that night, the thing that makes the observation more than a private compliment from one performer to the reputation of another. Whoopi Goldberg, after saying what she said to the people at her table, went backstage, and she found Katt Williams. Whoopi Goldberg's relationship to stand-up comedy is not the relationship of an observer. She began in the specific tradition of one-person theatrical stand-up that runs from the 1960s and 1970s through the breakthrough HBO special that introduced her to the national audience in 1985. Her work in that tradition was not the observational stand-up of the comedy club circuit. It was character work, fully inhabited, complete figures brought into the room and sustained through the full length of a performance. A different branch of the same tree, requiring different skills and a different relationship to the audience, but rooted in the same fundamental act, a single person in front of other people, producing something in real time with no safety net between what they create and the response it receives. What that origin gives a person, what a career built on that specific vulnerability produces in the performer who has done it long enough to understand it from the inside, is a specific kind of vision. The ability to see what another performer is doing at the level beneath the material. Not the jokes, not the structure, not the technique in its surface sense. The relationship between the performer and the room, the specific quality of the connection being made, the depth of the performer's actual presence in what they are doing versus their performance of being present. A distinction that takes years of doing the work to be able to see clearly, and that once visible, cannot be unseen. By the mid-2000s, Whoopi Goldberg had been doing the work for 3 decades. Her ability to see what another performer was doing at the level beneath the surface was calibrated to a standard that very few people in any room she walked into could match. This is what she brought to the event that night. Not celebrity observation, not name recognition. The specific visual equipment of a person who had built a career in the same tradition and had developed the precise ability to recognize the real thing when it was in front of her. And here is the second thing about that night. What she specifically said she saw within the first 2 minutes is something that Katt Williams himself has rarely discussed in his public accounts of his own work. The backstage conversation between Whoopi Goldberg and Katt Williams after the set was brief. Both of them had obligations that the event required. A performer who has just come off stage and an industry figure whose schedule has other claims on the rest of the evening are not in a configuration that supports extended conversation. What it supported was the duration it lasted, and what was said in that duration is the part of the evening that the people adjacent to both of them have been most careful in their recollection of. She said what she had said at the table, the specific observation about the relationship, but said it directly, to him, in the form that direct speech takes when it is addressed to the person it concerns rather than to the people who were adjacent to the performance. She named what she had seen. She did not elaborate beyond what the naming required. And she said one additional thing that the table version of her remarks had not included. Something about the responsibility that comes with the real thing, about the specific obligation that a performer who has actually made the connection owes to the maintenance of it. Katt Williams received this in the way he received the corridor conversation with Bernie Mac, the way he received what Chris Tucker had described, with the specific quality of attention that a person brings to information that comes from a source whose authority to provide it is unimpeachable. Whoopi Goldberg was not offering an opinion about his work. She was offering a reading of it by someone who had spent 3 decades developing the precise equipment for exactly that reading. The evening concluded. Both of them moved through their respective remaining obligations. The industry event produced its ordinary outputs: connections made, appearances fulfilled, the professional business of the industry conducted in the format that industry events provide. And in the record of that evening, what Whoopi Goldberg said to the people at her table, and then directly to the performer, is not included. It was a private response. It was never intended to be public. But in the career that followed, in the specific quality of presence that Katt Williams's work continued to demonstrate in the years after that evening, in the way the relationship between the comedian and the rooms he performed in continued to deepen rather than calcify, what she had said was there. In the way that honest recognition from the right source is always there in the work that follows it. Not as a specific influence on specific decisions, as a deepened understanding of what was actually being done and what it actually required. Comedy's generations do not often speak directly to each other across the distance of decades and different traditions. The form's most experienced voices and its most active current voices move through the same industry without the industry consistently providing them with occasions to say what they actually see in each other's work. The night at the industry event was one of the occasions, and what Whoopi Goldberg said, privately, specifically, from the equipment of a 3-decade career in the same tradition, was the kind of recognition that the form rarely produces through its official channels. Not a review, not an award, not a public endorsement. A description. From someone who had the vision to make it, to the person it described.